The Bill of Rights. So, I'm back. That's a good thing. So let's learn about the bill. And no, not the one that you see in the picture. Not that one. It's about the Bill of Rights. And it's a very important topic. Always shows up in our regions. So let's do this. Before we get to the Bill of Rights, we got to talk about the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Now, I briefly discussed it in my last review, but let's do it again. So, following a disaster known as the Articles of Confederation, and as a brief review, let's discuss the fact that it had no standing army, no federal power to tax, it couldn't tax, so no national currency, and a weak executive branch. So, something had to be done because the country was weak. It couldn't deal with the issues that were affecting it at that time. So, what happened was in 1787, 55 delegates convened in Philadelphia in order to create a new American Constitution. It was not an easy discussion, and think of a constitutional convention as a series of compromises. So major compromises had to be made in order to ratify it. So let's review them. When I watch the news and I see the current political tensions between Republicans and Democrats, one of the things that modern politicians lack is an ability to compromise. Both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, both modern political parties, can't compromise on most issues. That was not the case with our founding fathers. They could compromise. So, let's talk about it. So, the Great Compromise of 1787. So, there were a couple of plans that were presented at the Constitutional Convention. The first was the New Jersey Plan, which favored small states. So, what happened was that one house, there would be a one-house legislature, which would be unicameral, and each state would get an equal representation in Congress. That was their plan. That was the New Jersey plan of some delegates. There was also something known as the Virginia Plan, which favored large states. So there would be a two-house legislature in the new American government, and two-house legislature would be called bicameral legislature, and representation would be based on the population. So the bigger your state is, the more representation you're going to get in Congress. So the result of that was the Great Compromise of 1787, which basically stated that there would be a two-house legislature, which would be known as the Congress. So, what is Congress? Well, Congress has a Senate, which means that there is equal representation from every state, because there are in a Senate there are two senators from each state, no matter how small or big your state is. So, for example, a state as small as Hawaii would have two senators in the Senate, just like a state like Texas or New York. So that satisfied the small states, but you also have the large states. So in order to satisfy them, in order to give them what they want, they created something known as the House of Representatives, where the representation would be based on the population. So the more people you have in your states, the more representatives you're gonna get in Congress, in the House of Representatives. So in order to count how many people you had, in your state, there would be something known as a census. Every 10 years, we have census where they count how many people we have. So there was also something known as the 3-5 compromise. So southern states wanted to count slaves. If you remember, African Americans were enslaved back then, so they wanted to count slaves to get more representatives. But North only wanted to count them for taxation purposes. So the result was the 3-5 compromise. A slave who technically had no rights back then, but a slave was counted as a 3-5 of a person. And it was not for both representation and taxation purposes. So those are the major points of the Constitutional Convention that you need to know for your regions. Debates over the ratification. So when you think about debates over the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, think about debates between Federalists versus anti-Federalists. So Federalists, some of whom included people such as Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, what they wanted to do is they wanted to ratify the Constitution as it was. They didn't want to make any changes to it. So they wanted a strong central government. So in 1788, they actually wrote a series of 85 essays known as Federalist Papers to promote that the ratification. So if you guys keep writing your essays, think about the founding fathers who had to write 85 essays in order to promote the ratification of the Constitution. So there was also a group of people known as the anti-federalists. Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry were two of those people. So what they did was they opposed the ratification of the Constitution because they feared that the strong central government would abuse its powers. Basically, they didn't want a new king. So they called for the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So they wanted to guarantee the protection of people's rights. They wanted those guarantees to be there in the Constitution. So Federalists, who originally argued that the separation of powers between two branches, there's an executive branch, which includes the president, the legislative branch, Congress, and the judicial branch, Supreme Court. So what they argued was that the separation of powers between these three branches was enough to protect our freedoms. We didn't need anything else. We didn't need the Bill of Rights. But, they finally gave in. So the new U.S. Constitution with the Bill of Rights was finally ratified in 1787. So that's what you call a compromise. This is something that our modern politicians can't do. There are very few modern politicians who would diverge from the official stance of their political party. Very few. And if they dare to do that, they're bound to get the establishment of their party against them. It's a very risky move for any politician from any political party, Republican or Democratic. The amendment. So the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Before we talk about them in details, let's review the amendment process. So an amendment is a change to the Constitution. So how do we pass one? So in order to pass an amendment, there needs to be amendment needs to be proposed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress. Good luck to that ever happening. If that ever happens, good luck. 2/3 of all states must agree. But if that happens, an amendment would become part of the Constitution. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon because, the politics of this country today, you know, it's a really, politicians are really divided on most issues. So, in order to pass an amendment, they need to be united. And, I just don't see it happening anytime soon, but let's just review it. So, unlike what happens with laws, a president cannot veto an amendment. So let's say Congress decides to pass an amendment and the president does not like it. He can't do anything about it. There's nothing that he can do. I mean, the only thing that he can do is he can argue against the ratification of that amendment. He can talk about it, but there's nothing else he can do. There's nothing else that he can do. And the Supreme Court cannot really strike it down. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to do anything about an amendment because it's not a law. It's not a bill. I mean, it's not a bill. And to this day, Constitution has 27 amendments. In this video, we're only going to talk about 10 of them. And, alright, so let's go. The First Amendment. So, when you think about the First Amendment, you have to think about the freedom of speech. That's the first thing you have to think about. So, the freedom of speech. It means the government cannot punish you for what you said. So, you're free to express your opinions and even to criticize the government itself. This is very important in a democratic society because, in many countries around the world, your speech can often land you in prison, and you can be severely punished for it. So, it just makes you more appreciative of the freedom of speech. You have to appreciate this right that you're given in this country. So, the freedom of speech. Next one is the freedom of religion. You are free to believe in any religion you choose. A government cannot force you to believe in a specific God. Nor can they deny you, very important, they can't deny you the right to worship your own God. In addition to that, there is a separation of church and state. It means the government cannot be ruled by religion. It has to be a secular government. Next one is the freedom of the press. Press is anything, newspapers. Nowadays, in modern times, it's the media. So the press is not controlled by the government. That's what it means. And it's very important because it can criticize the government. And it makes sense because, in a democratic society, it can serve as a check for the government. So remember checks and balances? The press is another check. And it can expose some of the abuses that the government has. And it can expose some of its abuses on power. In many countries around the world, where the press is tightly controlled by the government, and there are still many countries around the world where that happens. No criticism is allowed. In fact, if you were to watch their news, what they would do is they would often praise their government. No criticism is allowed. So think of it as a scripted show. If you were to watch the news in a country where no criticism is allowed, it would be, basically news would be scripted and it had to be censored by the government. It's not very important. Very important. You cannot have a democracy without the freedom of the press. Next one is the freedom of assembly. People have the right to assemble, to voice their political opinions. Freedom of assembly. Very, very important. Let's talk about the Second Amendment. It is the right to bear arms. People have the right to legally own guns in this country, and government can't ban them. They cannot ban guns. The only way to ban guns would be to overturn the Second Amendment, which in the current political climate would be impossible. The only way to overturn an amendment is with another amendment, and it would be impossible to do in this country today. You can't. Now, some of the southern states uh, who are generally more gun friendly will never agree to it. So, some states try to get around this and make it very difficult for people to legally buy guns. It's a lot easier for people to, let's say, to legally buy guns in a state like Alaska than it is, in New York State, the state of New York. Some states, they try to get around this and make it difficult for people to legally buy guns. And you don't really need to know this for the Regents, but I feel like I need to give you guys a little bit of a background. And I want to talk about the Supreme Court case of McDonald versus the city of Chicago, which goes back to 2010. Well, Otis McDonald was a 76-year-old retired man living in Chicago. What he wanted to do is he wanted to purchase handguns for self-defense because he argued that his neighborhood, had a lot of crime and gangs, and he needed to defend himself. But there was a problem with that. In 1982, Chicago banned all handguns. They were illegal. So what he did was in 2008, he filed a lawsuit against Chicago, which eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court. And a closed decision, because it was a closed decision on a very controversial topic. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that Chicago's handgun ban was unconstitutional because the Second Amendment did apply to the states, and they cannot, state or city, they can't ban handguns. They can't ban handguns. Yeah, so Chicago tried. It succeeded for a while, but eventually their ban was overturned. And it just tells you that the only way to ban guns would be to overturn the Second Amendment. As long as we have the Second Amendment, people are going to have the right to legally own guns. I know some states will make it easier for people to legally own guns than the others, but the bottom line is people have that right. The Third Amendment, I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it might show up on the Regents, but it's a very simple topic. So basically, Third Amendment means that no. Third Amendment says that no quartering of soldiers in people's houses. A government can't send soldiers to live in your house. They can't. It all goes back to the British Quartering Act of 1765, where American colonies were required by Britain to house British soldiers. So, Third Amendment, no quartering of soldiers in your house, in people's houses. Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable search and seizure. So, a government can't search your belongings without a probable cause. But the funny thing about it is that schools can search you. A notable Supreme Court case would be New Jersey versus TLO, all the way from 1985. So what happened was in 1985, principal of a Piscataway Township High School found that TLO, which is the name of a student, it's abbreviated. and another girl that were smoking in the school bathroom. So what happened was the other girl admitted to smoking, but COO refused to comply. And her purse was searched and they found cigarette paper, marijuana, a pipe, and other items in it. So what happened was the state filed a delinquency proceeding against her. But she appealed all the way to the Supreme Court on the grounds that her Fourth Amendment rights were violated. She argued that they can't simply search her things. They're her things. They can't search it. But the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that her Fourth Amendment rights were not violated. They weren't. Schools can search your belongings. So, that's the Fourth Amendment. Fifth Amendment. Trial by grand jury. No double jeopardy. You cannot be tried twice for the same crime. If you were tried for a crime and found innocent, guess what? They can't try you again. That's the good thing about double jeopardy. No double jeopardy. They can't try you again. Let's say, even if you were to admit that you did it, they still can't try you once, you got a verdict of being innocent. So I'll say, even if you were to hold a news conference the next day and yell, "I did it, you suckers," they can't try again. They still can't try you. Once the case is closed, it is closed. No double jeopardy. They can't try you again for the same crime. You can't testify against yourself, of course. And another important issue is due process of law. The due process of law, basically what it means is you have a right to have a fair trial, where all your legal rights are protected. And another thing about the Fifth Amendment is the fair compensation clause. Fair compensation means that, let's say government wants to take your property for public use in something known as the eminent domain. They have to pay you, of course, fair compensation. That's what the Fifth Amendment states. And government can do that. So let's say you have a house and it stands on a piece of land where a government wants to build a school or a railroad or something of that sense, or a subway station, something of that sense. They can take your property. It is known as eminent domain. So what the Fifth Amendment does is it states that if you're going to take my property, make sure to compensate me fairly for it. Don't give me $5 for a house, basically. All right. The Sixth Amendment. You must be informed of charges against you. So if you're arrested, they have to tell you what your crimes are. What they are charging you with. Speedy and public trial, that's the second thing. Then it's the jury trial. And speedy and public trial is very important because you don't want, a trial to drag on for years, and you want the trial to be public, because this way, you know that you're getting a fair trial. People are able to see that you're getting a fair trial. And the jury trial, of course, is very important because what that means is that you will be tried by a group of citizens, just like you. And the idea is that a group of citizens will be able to give a fair, make a fair decision about whether you're guilty or innocent. Next point is the right to face witnesses against you in court and call witnesses in your defense. You have the right, that means you have the right to face people who are going to testify against you. So let's say someone is going to state that you did something. You want to be able to know who that person is, in order to build your defense and so forth. And secondly, call witnesses in your own defense. That means if you know a person who will be able to testify that you are innocent, you have that right. You can call innocent. You can call witnesses in your defense. And you also have a right to have a lawyer, and that's very important. Not to be confused with Miranda rights from 1966. A lot of people confuse the two. So back when the Sixth Amendment was being ratified, they just gave you the right to have the lawyer. It means if you were rich and you can afford a lawyer, you had the right to have one, which was still important for that time period. But Miranda rights, 1966. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about it here, but basically Miranda rights, that's when they have to tell you that you have the right to be silent, to remain silent, and anything you say can be used against you, and you also have a right to a lawyer. With Miranda rights, if you can't afford a lawyer, government must provide you with one. But with the Sixth Amendment, you just have that right to have a lawyer. You have the right to have a lawyer. And it's so very important because anytime a person is accused of crimes, it's very important to have somebody knowledgeable about laws, and a lawyer is very knowledgeable about it. A lawyer knows the law. He knows you want somebody like that defending you in a court of law. Okay. The Seventh Amendment. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on it. In fact, I'm gonna spend a very short time on it because the only thing you have to know about the Seventh Amendment was that it's talking about the right to have a jury trial in civil, non-criminal cases. When they're talking about civil cases, it could deal with contracts that were not fulfilled or something of that sort, but nothing criminal. So you have the right to have a jury in civil cases. Eighth and Ninth Amendments. So they're really short amendments, so I decided to combine them. So let's talk about the Eighth Amendment. So Eighth Amendment basically means that there should not be any cruel or unusual punishments. So no cruel or unusual punishments. It basically means that government can't torture you as a punishment for your crimes. Because that's cruel, right? And no excessive bails or fines. So if you're ever arrested and they allow you to have bail so you can get out of jail until you have a trial, that bail cannot be excessive. It cannot be worth several $1,000,000 if you can't afford it. Or fines. Fines also have to be reasonable. That's Eighth Amendment. But let's talk about the Ninth Amendment. Ninth Amendment states that you have the right. You still have rights, not listed in the Bill of Rights. I know it's a little bit confusing, but bear with me. So what it means is, what the founding fathers wanted to make sure was that the rights listed in the Bill of Rights would not be our only rights. So they wanted to make sure that there are other basic rights. I know it's confusing, and back really long back when I was in high school, and in middle school, I think, well, the first time when I saw that amendment, you know, I got confused a little in some ways. But once you really try to understand what it means and what the founding fathers want to make sure, it's really not that confusing. The 10th Amendment, aha, that's gonna give me an opportunity to really get my own opinion about it, but let's state the fact that the 10th Amendment states that rights not given to the government are reserved to the states. So that's what you gotta know about the 10th Amendment. But let's talk about public schools. So, public education, which is related to that amendment. So, states interpret the 10th Amendment as the right to have individual control over public education. An assumption with which I disagree. I believe that there should be a strong federal control over a unified system of public education. But we have a system of public education that's controlled by the states. So each individual state has its own Department of Education. So, in my opinion, we have a system of public education which is inherently unequal due to various standards in many states. So some states could have a better system of public education, while others might lag behind, and that's not a good thing for a country like the United States. We have to be on top. We have to have a standard system of education. And I love history, but my views are different from what many of your teachers might think. But because in my personal opinion, Regents exams are not necessary. That's my personal opposition. I have my personal opposition to Regents exams. These videos that I'm making are designed to help you guys pass your Regents exams, but personally, I don't think that there should be any Regents exams. And the New York State is the only state that has those requirements, which goes back to the 10th Amendment. What's happening is that teachers are forced to teach to the test, while ignoring many important topics that never show up on the test. There are many topics which are very important, in the field of history, which are being overlooked or ignored because, they never show up on the test. They never show up on the Regents. As a result, students are stressed out trying to pass the Regents. And what happens? Let's be honest here. Many times, once you pass the Regents exam, what happens? Once you know you passed, you forget most of the information on that Regents. And that's normal, most people do that. But, colleges, once you apply to college after high school, you're going to learn that most colleges, pretty much all colleges, they don't look at your Regents grades at all. What they will look at are your SAT scores. So that's the 10th Amendment. Thanks for watching my short review of the Bill of Rights. Please note that this is not a comprehensive review and is not designed to replace your social studies textbook, but rather to complement them. I did skip over some parts in the Bill of Rights, and I'm aware of that, as it is a brief review. So it is essentially designed to help students pass their United States history and government Regents. Because questions about the Bill of Rights always show up in one way or another. You might have a multiple choice question on it, or it might show up in the DBQ section, or the essays. So you gotta know about them. And finally, if you made it this far through my video, you will experience cruel and unusual punishment by having to listen to my terrible song, which is a parody of Nirvana's "Smells Like Teen Spirit." Good. All right. Good luck in your Regents.
Let's learn our bill of rights today, no matter what they have to say. It's so important that we know, and it's important that we show. Amen, 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 amendments, amen, amen, amendments, amen, amen, amendments. Amen, 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 First Amendment. Number second, freedom of speech, right to bear arms, opposition, of religion, of assembly, introduction, then a third one, no more soldiers in our houses, founding fathers, yeah. The Fourth Amendment, don't you search the fifth, the process stands and urge. The sixth, the right to speedy trial, the seventh, jurisdiction denial. Amen, amen, amendments, amen, amen, amendments, amen, amen, amendments. Amen, 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 First Amendment. Number second, freedom of speech, right to bear arms, opposition, of religion, of assembly, extradition, then a third one, no more soldiers in our houses, founding fathers, yeah. That Eighth Amendment, don't be cruel. The ninth, you have your rights, you too. In tenth, you give it to the states, and that's just how the story ends. Hello, 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 hello. First Amendment, number second, freedom of speech, right to bear arms, opposition, of religion, of assembly, extradition, number third one, no more soldiers in our houses, founding fathers, a detention, 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 a detention. Hesitation.